Welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum where we explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mathieu Glaude. Today I host Caspar Roelofs, founder at Gimly Projects. During this conversation, we discuss Caspar's PhD research background in biomedical sciences, studying why some artifacts of knowledge end up being successful and embraced, while others don't. We talk about using physical cards as cryptographic stores for private keys and verifiable credentials, and then transacting via NFC. We also discuss various use cases of verifiable credentials using NFC, such as offline and connectionless use cases. We discuss NFTs, non-fungible tokens, and if SSI could perhaps help increase the value of a community-created NFT by ensuring the proof of ownership or creation at time of minting. We also briefly touch upon SSI use cases for decentralized finance, often referred to as DeFi, towards the end of the conversation. Now, without further ado, here's the conversation with Caspar Roelofs. Enjoy. All right, Caspar, as a starting point, I would be interested to hear a little bit about your background and how you found your way into blockchain and self-sovereign identity. I know you, in a past life, not too long ago, but did PhD research in sustainable biotech innovation. I'd love to hear a little bit about that. I'm actually quite interested in the whole biotechnology space as a whole, but interested to just hear about you going through this, what necessarily you did, what research you did, and what you published in that space, and how you kind of transitioned. I don't know if you transitioned completely out of there, but how you kind of found your way into this whole Web3 world.
Yeah, thank you, Mathieu, for having me. So my background indeed has been one of a few turns. Before I founded Gimli 2 years ago, I was doing my PhD research at the University of Groningen. I have a background in biomedical science, actually, but in doing my master's and afterwards, I pivoted away from the laboratory type of work more towards the social sciences, asking questions like what is knowledge and why do some artifacts of knowledge end up being successful and embraced by a wider majority, and others remain unembraced and never accepted, less successful. And how it is that this really isn't about one type of knowledge or one knowledge being better than the others, but really a lot about the context around it and the societal systems around it, the alignment of stakeholders around it. How strong is your network of stakeholders when you're thinking of something new? That all influences how knowledge is shaped. So from that perspective, I really started focusing on a field called science and technology studies. But that's all about the co-evolution of society and technology and politics and how they all influence each other. And that's a topic that I find hugely interesting. Also now in blockchain industry, blockchain innovation. You're right. At the time, the research was about biotechnology. So the question was pretty much how biotech innovation is shaped by the societal context and political context, and specifically in African countries. That was a topic, focusing a lot on genetic modification of crops, and how all kinds of political narratives, societal narratives around this technology is very much shaping its innovation.
That's super interesting. There's a really good, I think, like you so often see good examples of cross-discipline kind kind of amalgamation or whatever. And it's not only one thing that is the driver. And there's a really good piece
Mm.
about just on COVID. It's obviously topical of just how different aerosol scientists were trying to drive forward the thinking that this was actually a virus that was carried in the air, and just the troubles they had getting
Oh,
people to believe
absolutely.
that, and how they had to involve just um, um, historical stuff and involve research. And it's just, so when you start talking about the kind of societal context around, or just involving the social sciences around um, a science like biotechnology, that is quite interesting. And I think as you moved, I guess, towards the blockchain and self-sovereign identity space, it's quite true as well, right? It's where you have all these different layers that play together. It's not like, yeah, I'm doing technology now.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And well, I do want to make clear also to the listeners that I actually, after 4 years of PhD research, I didn't finish the PhD. So just to put that out there for clarity. And part of the reason for that is that I felt it becoming very difficult to continue pursuing my theoretical interest in these type of questions, where I would want to explore questions around why are certain innovations taking place, what are the drivers behind that, and because more often than not, the drivers are not per se a objective what is best. Drivers are very often economic and political, and sometimes also just what is convenient, coincidental convenience at the time. Um, but that became a bit more difficult, and after a while. In the meantime, in my free time, I had become very interested in Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and I started reading more and more and spending more and more time on the topic of what is this technology, this blockchain technology, and why is it so interesting and potentially disruptive. Um, and yeah, also how is blockchain technology, hopefully decentralization, blockchain technology, and of course self-sovereign identity. How can they be different from many of these other technological revolutions that have been previously hailed as the next revolution, democratizing the world and resolving poverty and all that. Um, so that there are a lot of cross pollinations in those type of interests, for sure.
And I think there's clearly a lot of societal, as we talk about societal context, there's a lot of societal movements with just people in general, where people are becoming more socially aware. People are wanting to have more transparency, more information into the stuff that they buy or purchase. They want to have more visibility and transparency in different relationships they have. They care more about social responsibility. So you have all these trends that, on a
Hmm.
societal level, I guess, that align very well with the whole, call it Web3 or blockchain, call it what we want. Um, what were some initial use cases that really, like, once you got into Bitcoin, I think it's a similar story with most people getting into Bitcoin
Yeah.
or Ethereum, or someone gets into another project. I'm always curious outside of those two, what drew them to that. But when people get into the space, you kind of you start understanding how fundamentally different these decentralized properties are for storing
Hmm.
assets, and then
Yeah.
being able to do other stuff with it. What were some of the initial use cases that interested you, I guess, on the enterprise side, or just seeing, hey, these are some things that I think I could contribute to or help build?
Yeah. Well, really quite at the beginning of my journey, so to say, my interest went out to the nexus of the physical and the digital worlds, so to say, where you have the immutability of the blockchain, but then the question of, okay, but what happens at this interface of the digital blockchain when it starts touching on the physical world? Like, what type of data do you get in there in the first place? How do you how can people or machines or organizations interact with this blockchain technology? How do you connect those two quite difficult to connect worlds? Um, so I was looking a lot at solutions where, for example, IoT sensors are being connected to blockchains, and quite early. After I started Gimli, I ran into Tangem actually. Tangem is a Swiss manufacturer of uh, NFC chips that have the capability to sign a blockchain transaction right in their NFC chip. And at the time, they were mostly using it, and still the most known use case for it is for signing cryptocurrency transactions. So you would basically have a uh, uh, a, a crypto hardware wallet on your NFC card, and you could sign a transaction by tapping that card, or you could give that card to someone else, and then you hand over the the, the cryptocurrencies that are on that wallet, because you're handing over the private key, which is inside the chip. Um, Immediately I said, well, I mean, that's very interesting, and indeed I haven't seen any other NFC chip that can do that. There are some similar chips that, they can be connected to a blockchain, but usually the signing and the private key management happens somewhere in the cloud or in a server. So I felt it was interesting, but I also immediately said I think it's even more interesting for these sort of supply chain use cases to connect the physical goods shipments in a secure and immutable way to the digital twins in within the blockchain network. So that was really the uh, first topic of interest, I guess, the supply chain and provenance and anti-counterfeit. Um, and that quite soon led actually to the topic of self-sovereign identity, which basically I was thinking about identities for objects and ways for people, humans, but also machines to identify themselves in a blockchain system. So that's where I quite soon ended up being focused on self-sovereign identity as the core building block for pretty much everything related to the future of internet. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we had similar entry points, you and I, into self-sovereign identity, just looking at these decentralized use cases and seeing that certain properties were potentially missing. And the main property to do, I guess, was verifiability, where it's like, yeah, it's great that I'm building a supply chain system and I'm trying to increase the transparency in a supply chain. I'm trying to give more visibility to the end consumers or even regulators throughout the supply chain or whoever is a stakeholder there. It's great that I have an immutable record, but it's like the same old concept. If it's like garbage data in, you're going to get garbage data out of it, right? And so how do you control the data inputs coming in? It's, I guess, through that property of verifiability. And I guess so it's the same thing is the whole concept then that with these NFC chip cards, you could transplant that concept basically into an IoT device as well to ensure that it's the right IoT device that's signing off on transactions. Is that the idea?
That's definitely the idea that one of the ideas that I'm exploring for more longer term, indeed. Yeah, exactly that, to have the same capabilities. Like I have an embedded private key in a secure element within the IoT device, and be able to verify the identity of verify the source of your IoT data through an SSI mechanism. That's the longer term, broader vision when talking about supply chain, for sure. Yeah. But there, I mean, there are smaller steps in between, right? I don't feel I need to do everything with the chips directly. But they do open up a lot of potential for self-sovereign identity in many more use cases, also supply chain and enterprise, but also other use cases where you don't where you cannot or you don't want to rely on the use of personal smartphones, either because not everyone in this whole world has a smartphone. Sometimes we tend to forget that. And when talking about self-sovereign identity, which has such a important philosophical background, so to say, I find it important to realize that a lot of the things that we are now developing and now working on are very much focused on the use of personal smartphones, and that for the time being, that will be largely for a small proportion of this world. So possibly using these cards as a way to also identify and verify yourself could contribute that. I'm also very realistic there that even for the time being, with the use of these smart cards, you will probably also want to have a smartphone to be able to manage the credentials that you're sharing or not. But there are some I do have one project where using these cards, when there's a single purpose, for example, as a student ID card, they could work, and then they would also work for students who do not have a smartphone. But yeah, there obviously are some complexities in there. I'm very well aware of that, but I think it's just interesting and important to explore how can we take the self-sovereign identity a bit broader than just smartphones.
And good point. I think it does open up a lot of other use cases. If we talk about like financial inclusivity use cases, or you mentioned single purpose use cases, like getting into a building, like building access is a single purpose use case, and potentially it's a much more straightforward implementation than selling a mobile or some other type of wallet to an enterprise that doesn't want to have their data or their assets sitting outside of their four walls, their four digital walls. It also opens, and it also opens up I think a space we're seeing a lot more talking about right now is the whole connectionless use cases, where I think when you talk about the mobile SSI wallets today, they basically do two things. They help you manage your credentials and they help you manage your connections. But there are certainly some use cases that are very valid and valuable, maybe without having the need to have a connection.
Absolutely, yeah. It's also actually a very important use case for Gimly, for us, where we see this as a way to enable also self-sovereign identity in enterprise settings, where you don't want your employees to to run around with their personal mobile phone, signing off on potentially sensitive data, or every time that they need to identify themselves when they pick up a shipment to stick with the supply chain use case, um, and and where employees are using company managed devices in their on the premises, um, then we propose to use these cards for the employees to log in and to sign with their personal card, which is connected to their personal identity or their employee identity, however you want to structure this, of course. And they can log in with that card into the application on the company managed device, and then 2 hours later, a different employee can log into that same device, signing off with their own decentralized identifier, for example. So that's another very important direction that I see this going. Yeah.
And in any use case, I guess that if you have a quadrant of high volume, low volume, and high risk, low risk, like any high volume and low risk type of transaction, for example, getting into a building, it probably could make sense to adopt something like that, just like signing off on a shipment, where that's where I find it quite interesting, where and the supply chain use cases are difficult too, just because of the different fragmentation that inherently exists within any mature supply chain, where there's a lot of specialization across the supply chain, means there's tons of different organizations and people involved, means there's tons of different systems involved. And when you start getting into the whole ERP kind of hole, you kind of get lost in the complexity, and you realize that, wow, that's a crazy space. So you could potentially, without saying like, hey, I'm going to connect all these ERP systems together to get transparency, you could just use the signing, using the credentials to create some form of, I guess, a chain of verifiable credentials. Instead of just having everything sitting on a blockchain. So was this the use case in particular that you ran through? I know Momentum 2020, an event that I know you were describing to me earlier, that was all about kind of physical world stuff, but due to COVID, obviously, like a lot of stuff had to go digital. What did you do at this event, and was it this exact supply chain use case?
Yes, it was actually. So that was indeed Odyssey Momentum. It used to be Odyssey Hackathon, one of the largest hackathons, physical hackathons in at least in Europe. Well, at least pretty big. Let's keep it at that. But that was very much also about the physical experience of being in that old factory, which was, by the way, also in Groningen, but that was a coincidence. But yeah, and then of course came COVID, so it was postponed a few times, and ultimately they decided to give it an entire new direction, make it a fully virtual event, and since then it has become Odyssey Momentum. The idea behind that is not to have it as a single moment in time where people do a one-time trick, so to say, and after that it's over. The idea is to really build ecosystems and keep the momentum of innovation continuing. So now it was fully virtual, and our use case, we participated in the KLM challenge for a compliant air cargo flow. And we proposed to use these Tangem cards as a physical identifier in self-sovereign identity, pretty much in the way that I just described it, where you could use it for an employee to log in or to sign off on a certain shipment. Yeah, we actually won as one of the two teams. The other one was Crypto Mice, who who developed or proposed a solution to track a shipment and to analyze if there are any potential red flags. Like if you would see, in the electronic airway bill, it was stated that shipper A is going to pick it up, but now we see that shipper B picked it up. So maybe we need to look into that into a bit more detail. That's very roughly speaking their proposal. I hope I don't make them angry by describing it in that way. And using our signature, so to say, from the employees would be then could then feed into that analysis tool, so to say. Yeah, we actually did work quite a lot on the use case, also together with KLM and DHL. But then came COVID, or then still was COVID, and things got a bit stalled and slowed down, and it's it's still on the shelf somewhere, I think. But I hope to pick that up with them someday again.
It's a really good use case. I really like that too. And then just being able to use the cards to sign off on it too. It's kind of like, again, back to the connectionless potentially use case where it's basically for a chief compliance officer or someone to review afterwards, right? It doesn't need to be done all on the spot. So it's just like not every use case you need to have kind of the proof request and the verification and that decision at that point right away. There's some use cases where potentially I just want to log stuff for it to be audited later, but I want to have verifiability of who actually signed off on these things. I find that super cool.
Yeah. Well, it's also it is also an offline use case or a semi-offline use case where one party is offline, but the other party is online, and where you do the immediate verification, such as the example that you gave to enter a building, or when someone is coming to pick up a shipment at the Schiphol terminal. Then the driver, so to say, doesn't need to be fully connected, but the receiving party, of course, will manage that connection. Yeah.
Do you mind talking a little bit about just the European ecosystem overall? I think it's quite interesting for myself being in Canada, and a lot of the listeners, although there's a lot of European listeners here, but a lot of listeners in North America as well that are either in the public or private sector. I think what's happening in the EU right now overall is just extremely exciting with the momentum and the investment and the traction we're starting to see. So do you mind talking a little bit about how you fit into the European SSI ecosystem, and what are some of the organizations or ecosystems that you're a part of, or you really see momentum behind?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Canada is quite an inspiring example in terms of self-sovereign identity yourself, right? But you are right that in Europe there's also a lot of momentum and traction for self-sovereign identity. There's a lot of public interest, governmental interest in it, also in terms of funding, specifically in terms of funding. So there's, if I shouldn't even try to explain the funding ecosystem in Europe, but there are a lot of funding programs. Most of them are bundled under the grant Horizon 2020 until now. Now it's called, the new program is going to be called Horizon Europe, I believe. And if you look into a lot of the more recent goals, really in a lot of the programs, self-sovereign identity and the principles behind self-sovereign identity are really a core a core concept in those calls. Not all of them will mention it as explicitly as some others. One of the most explicit ones is SFLab, the European Self-Sovereign Identity Framework program, in which I am also participating now in the second infrastructure call. So that's one big one. There are a few more. There was also the NGI Onto-chain project, where we also made a self-sovereign identity proposal, because that was also about trust and verifiability and data exchange. Yeah, and there are a lot of programs like that that are really focusing on self-sovereign identity. Yeah, what else is there? I think it might be interesting to share also. We started 2 years ago, and in the meantime, from the start, my focus has been very much on collaboration, building partnerships, working with other companies that have certain expertises, and one of those companies has been Spherion. Spherion is also a Dutch company who has been in the space a bit longer than I have, and they have had a lot of experience in self-sovereign identity and in infrastructure building and components building, and we collaborated quite a bit. We also participated together in the first SFLab call, which was mostly focused on business solutions. So that was in a project with Off-Blocks actually, where Spherion is the technology provider. Yeah, since then things have moved quite nicely to be able to develop new things and to make new proposals in these NGI programs. There's actually also an NGI Atlantic program coming up, which is aiming to foster cross-Atlantic collaboration. So this might be something that you and I might want to explore.
I think that the one that I personally see a lot of stuff material come out of is the SFLab ecosystem, and so is the SFLab defining what kind of a governance framework or frameworks looks like and is funding projects, or what is the role of SFLab, or is it really just like an incubator type of organization?
Well, it's both. So SFLab has two tracks, so to say. One is called is focused on the infrastructure, and the other one is focused on business applications. So the second one is really more of incubator type, where project proposals are made, and it's also a contest. You start with geez, I forgot. Something like 17, I think, and then it like in 2 or 3 different steps, more and more teams, of course, get cut off. But the idea there is to also help the teams in their business development, in sharpening their business plan and product to market fit and those kinds of things. The other track is the infrastructure track, and that's where Gimly is now also participating in building a open source SSI NFC bridge, which is of course about these NFC chips that we talked about before, and we aim to make it possible to easily implement these NFC cards into any self-sovereign identity solution or platform. So that's a really very much open source focused track. and it's focused about also on defining the European self-sovereign identity framework. So it's a bit more about different types of wallets and more on the infrastructure side than on
Got
the
it.
application side.
Got it. Yeah, and that's great that there's just a business kind of side as well, and business focus and product market fit. I think that's obviously one of the bigger challenges with any new revolutionary type of technology is finding fit and not just trying to push tech.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I just want to switch a little bit. I think it's still kind of on the topic of trust and verifiability, and we've been talking a lot about NFC, and let's just switch the acronym slightly. Rather than talking about NFC, let's jump over to NFTs, which is a totally different space. But I think a lot of the stuff that you've been talking about is applicable here. You wrote a piece on something happening in the NFT space recently. Do you mind talking a little bit of kind of what the problem statement is behind what you had written in your piece?
Yeah, definitely. So I think NFTs are very very exciting, and if not for the technology itself, definitely for the movement that it's bringing about, and the new opportunities and new ways of approaching, for example, art and artists. I find that very very interesting. At the same time, with NFTs, there are some issues, if you may, that um, that I think remain to be resolved. And so the article that I wrote, the blog post that I wrote together with Jack Tanner, our dev lead at Gimli, it takes the example of where someone just took a screenshot from an artist's work, from Pitek, who is a Bitcoin artist, and she makes beautiful artworks representing the stock to flow model from Plan B, actually. And she uses all kinds of very rare materials, and she uses the stock to flow data points in her artwork. It's very she makes limited editions, and as people have been asking her, if like, hey, when are you going to make an NFT? But she and me, we were talking about, okay, but NFTs, what does it then mean? I mean, what are you, what is so special about NFTs, and what does it convey you actual ownership of? What do you prove ownership of? And basically, you're proving ownership over that NFT, and you can prove that there's only one of those NFTs, but it's a lot more difficult to prove that there's only one of those objects, be it digital or physical, that the NFT is referring to. And this becomes even more difficult when you're talking about physical objects, of course. Obviously, I would have a solution there in using these NFC chips, implementing those in the physical objects. But still, that doesn't resolve one key issue, where you don't know who. When you create an NFT, it's very difficult to also verify that the creator of that NFT is actually legitimate. And is that person that created the NFT legitimately authorized to convey ownership over the object that it's conveying ownership over? So in this use case, you saw where that someone just took a screenshot of her artwork and put an NFT on it and tried to sell it on Rarible. they didn't succeed. So and that's because some fans of Peter contacted her and asked her like, "Hey, did you really make an NFT?" And she said, "No, I didn't." And um, it turned out to be a scammer. Um, and then it got taken off a Rarible. But so what this illustrates is that really NFTs are they lack some identity layer where you can verify the creator of the NFT and the legitimacy of the NFT. Um, Now, of course, some people will say, yeah, but you can look up the public key of the first owner, and then you will see that he or she created multiple NFTs. And yes, that may be true, but um, there's no way for a an average consumer to instantly see um, yeah, the authenticity and the legitimacy of this NFT. And I think that's a very important aspect that uh, it doesn't mean an absolute no-go, but there is this idea around NFTs that because of the NFT technology, it is impossible to fraud, so to say. Um, and yeah, in the current hype, I think that opens up a lot of possibilities for all kinds of scams. And yeah, I would be interested in solving that um, by ensuring a connection to a verifiable identity of the creator and the buyer or the seller. I think that could be very interesting to explore.
Okay, it only increases the value of these things anyways if you have verifiability behind the creator of it. I think it's one thing to look at, and these are the ones that make the news, like the Christie's auctions auctioning a $69 million Beeple
Mhm.
compilation of,
Yeah,
of digital artwork. And just last week there was another one that went for some tens of million, and it was just I think that they were just avatars, right? But they're going through Christie's, and so
yeah,
Christie's is an established auction dealer of art, and so that is interesting. Where you're kind of again back to your whole. There's more that goes into it than just kind of the technology. There's like people trust Christie's. Christie's been doing this for
mm,
however long. They're reputable. So if Christie's is saying that, hey, we're selling this piece of art, there's trust that, yeah, this is a legit piece of art. This is a one of one, or whatever the different properties are. I think then when you start getting to more um, direct sales, which is the whole promise of a blockchain, is that you could go direct to creator to consumer. I don't need to go through kind of a broker or an intermediary. Maybe like someone like Christie's did a valuable service and really made sure that they got the right marketing and the price of that thing went up, I'm sure.
mm,
But for more kind of community driven initiatives, grassroots initiatives where people are trying to sell ownership or stake into digitally native assets, whether it's a piece of art or whether it's a piece of music or whatever it is, um, that's where I think, and I think you said it correctly too, for the average consumer, it's it's so easy to fall victim to phishing or to
yeah,
account takeovers or to stuff like that.
yeah. And I also find that the Christie's example and um, there's also, for example, Superware, like these platforms that do the um, how do you say, like the sort of the due diligence, like they will make sure that the one that's creating the NFT, that's creating the artwork, is also the legitimate creator, so to say. Um, so in those cases, it's a bit less important, and but at the same time, so a good friend of mine, Hassel Stoot, he's a digital artist, and he made quite a really cool digital video that went kind of viral, where you see Amsterdam as if Amsterdam is surrounded by mountains, which it is not because I live in we live in the Netherlands and it's completely flat. Um, and that went quite viral, and he was on. on a podcast, I think just 1 week back, together with John Crane from Superware, um, and one of the things that Hassel and me were also discussing is part about this verification of identity, which in the case of a Superware platform is a bit less of an issue. But at the same time, the whole idea behind NFTs for artwork is to enable any artist to become successful, so to say, right? You can in a decentralized world. That's one of the arguments in why NFTs are good for art. But then again, if you end up needing to be part of these curated platforms like Christie's or Superware, then that kind of defeats the purpose of anyone can get funded, so to say. Yeah, so I fully see the value of a platform like Superware, and at the same time, it's also a little bit contrarian to what NFTs are about.
Well, I think like the Christie's example is an interesting one because on one side you're using a blockchain as an immutable store for the asset itself, being a piece of digital art. You could be using smart contracts around that token, around that smart contract itself too. So you're really you're using a blockchain for a store of an asset, as well as potentially for some other computation. The trust in this case is in the physical world, because I'm trusting that Christie's has done the proper due diligence, like you described, has everything is legal, and I trust that. But when I don't have that physical trust and I'm looking to create digital trust, that's where self-sovereign identity, I see it being quite interesting. And although some could argue that if you have compliance or due diligence, other things, it takes away from the self-sovereignty of a blockchain overall, but you're able to create digital trust by just having the right credentials there too, at least to a certain extent.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, so don't get me wrong. I'm not anti NFTs. I think it's a very interesting technology. I think in some use cases where they are used for verification or authentication of something, I think in many use cases you'll be better off using verifiable credentials in an SSI system than NFTs. But in some other use cases, like in art and I think it's a very legitimate and interesting development. And one of my oldest partners, actually, Europe Chain. It's an EOSIO powered blockchain that aims to be the first or maybe the only GDPR compliant blockchain. They're also working on a lot of NFT projects where they very much focus on getting all these legal questions around it in order, such as what happens if the creator decides to make another NFT of exactly the same piece of art. Because NFTs are not going to prevent an artist from creating two NFTs where he says he was planning to make one. Of course, there are social systems that will prevent that, because the artist, kind of, how do you say, when you, in Dutch, you say you throw in your own windows. That's probably a different expression in English, but so of course that there's a social system around it that kind of prevents artists from scamming in that way, so to say. But still, there are legal questions like, what does it mean that I own something, that you own something, that you get ownership over a piece of art, over a piece of music? Are you allowed to display it? And if so, in which ways? So these are all interesting things that you need to consider also. Also, as an artist, if you're considering to NFT your work, there's some work to be done there.
I guess you could add more and more layers, like using verifiable credentials and using different mechanisms for even more digital trust for some of the problems we're talking here about NFCs. I think we agreed using an NFC as an identifier, maybe that's a whole other question. But I think regardless,
the acronyms are kind of mixing now, right? The
I
NFTs.
know.
Yeah.
Tough to follow these acronyms, but I guess you could digitize more and more, where I'm really trying to create as much digital trust as possible. But you still always have to have that element of human trust, where I think, like, again, like this is something I think you have said yourself too, that NFTs don't solve legal requirements, really. Like you still need to have kind of a human system or another system above kind of this digitally native automated system to really manage the governance and the legal rules and all this stuff above it.
Yeah.
Do you ever think about self-sovereign identity or verifiable credentials in the decentralized finance space? Is that something that you've thought about? Like, one thing that, just a simple use case I think about that I see, there could be value there, where it's like the whole DeFi space is, again, it's just we're able to conduct all sorts of different financial transactions without relying on a bank to do so. It's really peer-to-peer. But like, if I want to lend, if I'm lending to someone, I'm lending crypto to someone, I want to make sure they have a certain reputation or a certain credit score, for example. It seems like that could be done in a self-sovereign way as well. Did you think about that whole space?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's once again, that's why I kind of refer to self-sovereign identity as a pivotal building block for anything related to the future of internet and Web3, actually. Exactly like you say, that there's a need for identity also in DeFi. And of course, there are different levels of identity. SSI doesn't mean that you need to disclose your passport number with every DeFi transaction, but yeah, like you say, a way of a reputation. And yeah, I see a lot of potential in there as well. I'll be curious to see, for example, how. So you've probably seen the launch of Bullish, the new exchange from Block One. Block One, the company behind EOS technology.
Well, they just raised a good sum of money to bring this to market, right? It's just it's kind of a new type of exchange.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, a good sum of money, 10 billion was put into this. But from I'll be curious to see if how they will be handling this identification part. If their aim is to enable decentralized finance, but ensure compliancy with all kinds of global regulations, there must be some SSI component in there as well, if you ask me.
I think that's a huge market for SSI.
Yeah.
Especially like if you look at the top exchanges out there today, just naming a couple, like Binance, for example, or Coinbase, they're all obviously central companies that are managing this and managing the compliance and onboarding of users to allow them to get into the crypto world. But it doesn't protect the sovereignty of an individual, where you're going into there and you're giving them your driver's license or your passport or whatever information, and they are reporting that too. And we could argue about kind of what you should be reporting or not reporting. That's kind of a whole different topic, but it doesn't ensure your sovereignty. So that is quite interesting. If you could come into a crypto exchange, you could prove something through a credential, and by maybe partially disclaiming something, but that checks the box for their compliance. I would be quite interested to keep exploring that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think many of us have copies of their passports with dozens of more or less reputable exchanges, and especially if you've been in the space for more than 2 years, like before the bear market, you probably have your passports at quite a few exchanges that actually no longer exist. So who knows what happens there?
I think the users of these systems get it anyways, right? It's kind of like, it feels like an easier sale sometimes to someone that's already sold on crypto for different reasons. Being sold on kind of decentralized identity is just, it should be very easy to understand and digest. So when you talk about like gaining more adoption of self-sovereign identity, that is an interesting crowd where you could really see people buying into that a lot quicker, just because they understand it right away. They already think about this stuff. And Caspar, maybe a quick message before we end here, as I know you're looking for a new tech lead at Gimly.
At Gimly, we're very much focused on building applications and solutions based on self-sovereign identity. We're both at the protocol level, but also at the application level. And actually, we are expanding our team. I'm looking for a new tech lead to join us. So if there's anyone with some with the decent understanding of how cryptography works and some experience in blockchain technologies, different technologies might include EOS.io, Ethereum, Polkadot. Reach out and perhaps you can join the team at Gimly.
Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episode releases, please subscribe to the podcast on whatever channel you're listening to it right now. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me directly. You can find me online. I'm quite active on LinkedIn and Twitter, so I look forward to hearing from you. See you all next time.